The pulse of Canadian politics wasn't already racing. It certainly is now. U.S. President Donald Trump confirms tomorrow's deadline for a 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico stands and says there is nothing the countries can do to stop it.
Is there anything China, Canada, and Mexico can do tonight to forestall your implementation of tariffs tomorrow?
No, nothing. Not right now, no.
Not a negotiating tool?
No, it's not. No, it's a pure economic.
Okay, our party insiders are here on this breaking news day, because what other kind of day has there been for the past month? Greg McEachern is a former Liberal ministerial staffer. Fred Delory is a former Conservative campaign manager, and Melanie Richer is a former communications director for the NDP. Greg, what do you think? We're standing by tentatively. For a minute ago, we were supposed to hear from David McGuinty, who is in Washington. That's on hold right now. What do you think we're going to hear from the government tonight, the Prime Minister? What's your expectation here?
I would doubt that we're going to hear from the Prime Minister tonight, for the same reason anyone who's been watching you and your colleagues this afternoon, where you have President Trump contradicting himself, not having enough information. When Fred and I were here last week, you mentioned about how does Poilievre respond to this when you don't know what the facts are. How does the government respond? We still don't know. There's an old line, marry in haste, repent at leisure. This seems really fast and messy. And it's like watching a volcano and trying to keep up. You know, all of us have day jobs. We're, thinking of what our clients' reactions are to this, what Canadians are. And it's just, look, when I hear Canada in the same breath as Mexico and China, and nothing against those countries, except they were not in Afghanistan, where Canadians paid the ultimate sacrifice. Canada was. If you go to the State Department website right now, there is a page that, it's dated January 20th that talks about we are a huge energy supplier to the United States, especially in the Northeast. We are still their number one customer. And so I guess it's time to find, we're looking for some new people to do business with, because it does not make sense. I watched what the president said about tariffs. It's a beautiful word. I don't know if he understands the word, but it is just a really frightening time. And then the other thing, David, is just everything else that he's doing, mass purges at the FBI, et cetera. Like it is a very dark, very, very dark time.
He pardoned 1,500 people. He's blaming DEI on a plane crash with a helicopter. I mean, Fred, Greg laid out very rational and logical arguments on this, but it doesn't seem to matter right now in the Oval Office. It's what he wants to do when he wants to do it.
Yeah, he's been talking about it for a very long time, right? He talked about it last summer during the election. He was going to do this. He talked about it after the election. He's going to do this. So we're all sitting here and we're seeing it. It's hard to be surprised. I know he does a lot of radical things that we don't always expect, but he was pretty well telling the story he was going to tell.
At least in the tactic he wanted to use, but the motivation has changed like 10 times. Like the dollar amount is like, it was about fentanyl, it was about human trafficking. Now it's just like, we want pharma, we want copper, we want steel, it's everything.
He said it was economic, is what he said today.
Yeah.
Which is the true core of what this is all about, and it's going to have devastating consequences on both sides of the border.
So Mel, the domestic argument that's been going on here is we got to do this and he won't do it. We got to do that and he won't do it. And people started to do and move and accelerate and all of those things. And it sounds like as of 5:34 Eastern time, he's still going to do it no matter what.
Totally. And I think what we're seeing now, and maybe it's hindsight, but to your point, he's been talking about this for a while, the picking folks off or the divided strategy is obviously, it doesn't matter. He said very clearly, is there anything Canada can do? No, Canada can't do anything. Like we're doing this no matter what. So the fact that we've not all been speaking from the same speaking points, I think only just harms us and should reinforce what we've just seen from President Trump, that it is important, period, that premiers, prime minister, government, labor, everybody is speaking from the same speaking points. And I think making the message clear to folks around President Trump and making the message clear to state legislators, because this isn't going to be fun for them either. And obviously all of the things that governments provincially and federally have done to meet what President Trump was asking us to do doesn't matter. So you need to figure out what you need to be doing. And yeah, folks are rightly probably pretty terrified by that response.
Fred, just to come back to you on what Mel was talking about, getting everyone together, keeping everyone together. Right now it sounds like 25% on the entire Canadian economy tomorrow, but not on oil and gas until the 18th, and then only 10%. If he starts different standards for different sectors and different regions and different things. Boy, the ability to pull together a unified response, no matter who it is, that's going to be tough because you're going to get internal competition going on.
And when you're in the U.S. and you're sitting there and you want to call someone in Canada, who do you actually call? Who's the leadership right now? We have a lame duck government, a prime minister who has announced his resignation. We have a leadership that has 2 more months to go before we even figure out who our next prime minister is. And then how long before we actually get into an election? Will Jagmeet Singh make a deal or not? Every day that seems to twist around a bit. We could be months away from an actual government that has a mandate from the people. This is a mess, and I don't know how we're going to get through this without an election as soon as possible.
Okay, help me understand how an election makes this better. I get the mandate thing, right? I get that argument. The president of Mexico has a brand new mandate. She's there for 6 years. Not helping, right? So if you're going into this, and look, this is not an argument for Jagmeet Singh to support Justin Trudeau, but like what mechanically makes it better by having an election and going into caretaker mode for 5 weeks?
To have a government that could deal with Trump for the next 4 years that he's president, that's going to be stable and through this. If we have an election, we can get a mandate to a political party that can then make a plan for the next 4 years. Trump's in for 4 years.
Sure.
It's not 5 weeks.
But, Greg, if the tariffs are there on March 24th when Parliament comes back, I mean, who knows what happens between now and then, right? Like, if you need to pass legislation, if you need to do these things, if unemployment's 10%, if the economy is contracting by 2 percentage points, I mean, hit the campaign trail without doing the foreign interference stuff in a time when the U.S. president is calling the shots on what happens in the country. I mean, where does it get us as a country?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the partisan thing to say right now is I'd talk about the Liberal leadership, and I just think that's kind of ridiculous. I don't think people care right now about whether, Pierre Poilievre wants an election or not. Doug Ford's called an election, first winter election since 1981. I don't know what the rush was. And if something happens in Ontario, they can't reconvene Queen's Park. So I don't think, we still have to have the election. That would be weeks and weeks away. We have a parliamentary system. The UK went through this ahead of World War II, where they changed leaders. I think right now people are more concerned about what Mel was talking about, where all the leadership doesn't matter. We have a prime minister right now. We have premiers. They can work together on this or they can't. That's really up to them. Yeah. And I think, in the case of the Alberta premier, I don't think it's worked that well for her. And, there's a reason why Doug Ford called an election, because he thinks his actions thus far have been helpful for himself and for Ontario. Yeah,
like Mel, like Fred's central point that I think it's time for the political situation in this country to get clarified. A very fair one, right? But it's the timing and the mechanics of things I wonder about, because like Ontario is in this election right now. If they need to respond, I mean, I guess they have to break with the caretaker convention and just go function as a cabinet. But so much is happening so fast. I wonder what it means for even a campaign trail, because it's not like it's going to stop.
Right, totally. And what's interesting about a potential election or not is if this happens and the impact is immediate, if people are immediately losing their jobs or immediately things change for family budgets, I hear you that, we don't really know who's in charge or who's doing what and what we're going to do, but 5 weeks of that will be devastating for a lot of families. So I don't know that those families will want us to be in an election.
If I may, the House isn't coming back for another 2 months. We're talking 5-week election. We could have a new government in place at the same time by then, or an re-elected Liberal, or a DP government.
I don't like prorogation either.
I just don't understand. We're saying this 5 weeks or whatever. We could get this done and get a government in place with a mandate from the people to do things at a federal level, which is just completely missing right now. You could say it's partisan. It's not partisan.
I just don't. I honestly,
have a government right now.
Honestly,
they can't do anything. They can't bring in any legislation or bring in anything to help.
Well, look, there are some things they can do through, a couple of things. Just, and this is for the audience at home. I'm trying to explain as it's been explained to me. I'm not trying to rebut any of the pundits, but the tariffs will come in when they come in. The economy doesn't fall off a cliff within 24 hours. This will take 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months before it starts to seep in. This is the analysis that we've had from some economists. It's going to be broad-based and it's going to hurt, and some sectors will feel it right away. So there are things you can do simply through the executive power of government when it comes to EI regulations or different things to deal with some of the short-term stresses and strains. It's when it gets to the critical mass point that it requires legislation to bring in these, as they call COVID-style relief programs. Not COVID scale. The global economy is not shutting down, but COVID style aisle, that's when you need the legislature
So
to come
why
back, right?
if that takes
Yeah.
months and months before we're going to feel the effects of these tariffs, why don't we have an election before that, before going down this road and then having an election potentially during that time now?
Well, I think the answer, Greg, is that the Prime Minister took a long time to quit, and the Liberals in the middle of the leadership race, and they don't want one. I think that's probably the answer.
And I guess the Conservative talking point right now is called an election. Right.
That's not
Instead
fair,
of
Greg.
instead
Greg.
of dealing with I'm very
you have
I
nothing
am
to do,
very
no
Hang
I
on,
am
one at a
very-
time, guys, one at a time.
I'm very uncomfortable talking about this, these impacts through solely the lens of an election. I just think that there are a lot of Canadians right now that would be watching us going, those guys are out of touch. I'm about to have probably the biggest business impacts ever. We are talking about, especially if we have to retaliate, we are looking at a recession. And I think that's a bigger deal than that Pierre Poilievre is not getting enough attention, and because we're not talking about carbon tax anymore, and Justin Trudeau's announced that he's stepping down. I think today I saw a president who it just seemed to be, he reminded me, we have all trained politicians who are they just skim the surface. And he seems like he's gotten the briefest of briefs, and he's talking about that. And I find that incredibly frightening. And I said here last week, where is the Democratic Party? And I've noticed, Pod Save America, very well known Democratic staffer, former Democratic staffer podcast, and they're asking the same thing. I have no idea where the opposition to any of the horrible stuff that President Trump is right now. No idea. I do know where the Canadian governments, plural, are, but I have no idea where the Democratic Party is.
So Mel, election, no election, whatever, they'll figure that out, right? And I don't think we'll have an election before the leadership is decided at the Liberal Party on the 9th of March. But then, how do you, like Jagmeet Singh has said, if you want to help workers, come talk to me, and we'll find a way to help workers. I don't know if that works in the time frames of when they'll need sort of very specific help and without knowing specific things. But then we're going to bring it down, and we're going to have an election. How does your thought process and your political strategy calibrate when moving beyond Liberal, Conservative, New Democrat? It's Canada right now, right? And Mexico and Europe and everybody. I mean, how does your thought process calibrate when it becomes this much bigger thing?
Well, I think that's what you're seeing reflected from Jagmeet, right? And, folks have said, oh, he's not being cleared, seems not strategic or whatever, but I think that that's exactly what you're seeing. He's seeing this massive threat, and he's seeing that people could massively be impacted by it, and he's trying to find a way where we still go to an election when the timing right now for an election is March, because that is when the government will come back. And in the meantime, if you're willing to do something for people, let's talk. So I think that's exactly what you're seeing, is you're seeing somebody consider partisan interests, or, we need to go to an election because we don't think this government has confidence anymore. We don't think this government's acting on the best interests of people. And people could be massively impacted, and massively impacted soon. So I think that's exactly what you're seeing with his recommendations or his proposals that he's putting forward. But yeah, I think it's hard. It's a tricky time.
Yeah, and just to let you know, it is 5:44 Eastern Time. We were expecting to hear from federal cabinet ministers who are in Washington, D.C., meeting with their U.S. counterparts, kind of important conversations. That was supposed to happen at 5:30. We're hoping we're going to hear from them around 6 o'clock Eastern, so about 15 minutes from now. So we're standing by to bring you that live, and we'll update you on that when we get more hard information. But Fred, let's do a thought exercise, right?
Love these.
I know. Well, because it is.
Fred's getting ready.
It's the what happens if Fred Delory gets everything he's asking for.
Right.
You get your election, and you get Prime Minister Poilievre, and you get a clear mandate for a Conservative majority. What is it about what he said about the Canada-U.S. relationship and what he brings into a meeting with Donald Trump that you think makes this situation less dire than it is at this moment? How does he fix it?
For one, the most important part would be a clear mandate from the people to take Trump on, which no one currently has in this country at the federal level. That is the number one thing. He can go through a campaign, and we can have these discussions on how we're going to deal with this. It is going to become the top issue.
But beyond a show of electoral strength, what's the idea, and what's the plan, and what's in the track record that suggests that this is the answer?
Look, I think Poilievre has shown himself to be very adept and smart at politics and understanding where things go before they get there. We saw it with inflation and housing. He was way ahead on those issues. So I think he's a very smart guy, and I think he's got a good team around him that they're building that'll be able to show force against these guys and actually sit down and have these conversations. And I think as well, this is going to have a tremendous negative impact on the States. We don't know what stories or what things are being told to them from our side, because I don't know who's talking on our behalf.
Well, look, people keep saying that, but it's the Prime Minister and his ministers. They're in Washington, well, not the Prime Minister, but the ministers are in Washington, D.C. all the
But
time.
how credible are they when they've resigned?
I don't know.
right?
I mean,
Like,
Melanie Joly met with Marco Rubio. They're getting the meetings. I don't know. We're not in the room, right? But
how
they
much
are the
credibility
government
do
of the
they
day,
have
right?
when they're the government of the day for a Prime Minister that has resigned.
Sure.
So I just don't know how much credibility they have when they're out there talking on our behalf.
Okay, so Greg, on that point, right, the political situation for your party and for this government is not good, right, especially compared to the last time. Doug Ford says he needs an election. I don't know if there's going to be an Ontario Votes watch party at Mar-a-Lago or not, but, I have my doubts. They are going to Washington. We're waiting to hear from them, but they are in the situation they're in, as Fred correctly points out. So how do they make this work, given the fact that everyone knows there's a countdown clock on Prime Minister Trudeau and the polls are where they are, and the Americans are aware of that? How do they make it work?
Well, I'm trying to look at Premier Smith, who recently elected, went through a leadership review, flying colors. By the results, does she have a lot of credibility? I don't know if that's the issue. The three of us all grew up far outside the Ottawa bubble. We're in it. We live and work in it now. I can tell you that this is not even like the summer in terms of, Ottawa can feel very sleepy in August. It does not feel very sleepy right now. You talked about those ministers. It's go, go, go all the time. And I know this, and you two probably do as well because of our day jobs. But there is still a lot, at risk and a lot on the table. And the other thing is, to Fred's point about you need a mandate. The Prime Minister of our country, whoever it is at any time, has to respond to the threats of the day. You do not say, I didn't see this new president coming in and doing this. Let's call an election. Maybe Doug Ford is using that, but as Mel pointed out last May, he was talking about an early election. Donald Trump's tariffs were not even on the horizon at that point. So I think the reason for his election has changed, and he's able to perhaps spin it through different circumstances.
Right. Well, you should disclose to the audience that Fred is doing some work on the Doug Ford Ontario election, so there's limits to how far he can go on this conversation. So it is going to intersect with this larger thing, but I just want to let the audience know, because we want to be transparent here. I hope I'm not getting you in trouble by saying that, Fred. You just have to declare that. So, but on this, Mel, because I don't know if I got a clear answer there, Greg. How do they fix it with the situation they're in, right? Because there's nothing we can do, Trump says. So I don't know if you want a quick thought on that, and before I go to Mel.
I like the clarity that there was nothing, and I will give, the Premier Smith this. It turns out there was nothing that would have changed his mind. So it's a bizarre world. I don't know how to answer that, David. I'm sorry. But if he says there's nothing, what else could somebody do? Sorry, Mel.
There's just one
Very
line,
quickly.
Just one line he said, for now. Trump did say there's nothing they can do for now. I'm just curious what that means. I have no idea.
I have no idea. Sure.
So there's some kind of door open.
You may as well have put
a
a Latin text in front of me and asked me to translate it. But Mel, this is the situation that, because we've had this conversation, okay, have an election. Just give them defense spending. Just tighten up the border. Just do this, just do this. And it's like a whack-a-mole of reasons to avoid trade war. But I go back to this. I read this in November. This is from Politico. Google it. Lighthizer and his allies lay groundwork for Trump's massive new tariffs. This is the most clear-eyed analysis I've seen. Donald Trump's former trade chief and those close to him are preparing to aggressively sell their plans for massive new tariffs on imports that will go far beyond anything seen in Trump's first term. Memos among themselves as they prepare to convince lawmakers and the public that their plans for dramatically higher tariffs will energize the economy instead of tanking it. That's an orthodoxy. That's a philosophy. Like the people who've preached deregulation and free trade, this is the opposite of it. That's not transactional. That's, we want to use American might to reshape the economy. And we've all been running around like chickens with our heads cut off, blaming defense spending and blaming this and blaming that, when it's just what he wants is tariffs, it seems.
Yeah, like he wants to use his muscle. So what do you do in response to that, other than you got to fight back? I think, I'm obviously not an expert on any of these things, and I'm not in any of these conversations, but if you're on the schoolyard and somebody keeps pushing you around, eventually you kind of got to push back. And that's kind of what it sounds like. It sounds like there is nothing that can be done. It sounds like there's nothing that can be said. It sounds like there's no reasoning. It sounds like there's no proof that you could show and say, hey, this is going to hurt you in these ways. This is what's going to happen. This is what you're going to do to our economy, to your economy. It kind of sounds like you got to push back. And I think if that's the blueprint that they're following, yeah, it's going to be tough.
Well, Fred, to pick up on that schoolyard bully analogy, I was not a bully. You will not be surprised that I was bullied a time or two in my life, sometimes on this panel. But you dealt with it, you know, a kid born in the 70s, that you got to a point where you had to just inflict as much pain on that person as they were inflicting on you, and then it became a lose-lose for everybody. We'd like to talk about win-wins in the trade thing, but it seems like this is where we're all headed right now, that it's going to be a tightening of screws on both economies.
Yeah, look, it's going to be lose-lose. I don't know how this is going to stop inflation. It's going to explode on both sides of the border. If they're thinking that it'll remake U.S. manufacturing, if that's where, you know, instead of buying Canadian products, so they don't have to pay the tariffs, that they'll reinvest and build up their economy there. I mean, maybe that will happen at some level, but generally it's going to just raise the cost of everything, because what happens every time a tax comes in, it just gets moved to the consumer, and that's what's going to happen with the tariffs to Americans and Canadians when we have to retaliate.
So Greg, if this is, you know, the revelation of, you know, the true motivation here, if it is, he talked about it, we want to bring pharmaceuticals back to the U.S., so we're going to put tariffs on the European Union. You know, we got a lot of our vaccines during COVID from European countries who could have withheld it for their own national security reasons, but they shipped it even at the height of the pandemic. He wants to bring that back inside the United States. If it is this more fundamental use of American might to restructure trade practices and trade flows and where manufacturing is located, this is a much more difficult conversation for whoever is running whatever country to deal with, because it's day 11 of 1,461 days of Trump, and this is what he has said his goal is.
Yeah, and that goal, like the pharmaceutical stuff, is about getting brick and mortar back in the United States.
Jobs.
But that State Department paper that I referenced earlier, one of the things they talk about the collaboration with the United States was our approach to COVID and funding vaccines. The thing is, Trump also talked about defeating inflation and the price of eggs. Well, guess what? The price of eggs have never been more expensive, I think, than they are right now.
Because of avian flu.
Yeah, in the United States. I mean, I think it's great. Look, if I was a spoiler in this, I would try to find some sort of way to get Canadian eggs to a food bank in the United States. If you want to your point, kind of push back and punch a little bit and embarrass him on this, because what he wants to do on tariffs is, as Red pointed out, inflation is going to grow on both sides of the border. So his desire to pursue that is also going to defeat his promise to defeat inflation.
Yeah.
And that's going to be, I'm trying to find the bright spot here. I will enjoy watching that.
Yeah, look, the price of eggs is up, not because of Trump, it's because avian flu led to the slaughter of a bunch of egg-laying
Typical
chicken.
mainstream media and the facts.
We went through this in the post-COVID thing when people were putting pictures of chicken breasts in the price tag. It was because avian flu. It happens, right? And, you know, you get these industrial manufacturing things and a virus rips through and they got to be slaughtered, and there you go, that's it. But, you know, Mel, that challenge, you know, this is more fundamental and sort of a radical restructuring of things than it is, you know, fix your fentanyl problem at the border. You know, because the math on that never kind of made sense beyond an impulse, and to hit with a 25% tariff and these threats, it clearly is a more fundamental thing than this, than the initial thought and arguments have been.
And the idea there, that's not an idea that we haven't, or the principle behind it isn't necessarily a principle that we haven't heard, right? We've heard Canadians here even say, oh, you know, during COVID, our inability to get X thing or, you know, this thing has really had us behind. So the ability to produce stuff in country is generally a good thing that a lot of people like. It's the you know, the muscle to not just be able to do it inside, but to make us kind of the powerhouse in the world. I think that's the difference there. You know, you had Laura Dawson on earlier, and I had the opportunity to ask her some questions last week, and she said something about, to your point, Greg, of he has some very solid things that he wants to achieve, that he's told the American people that he wants to achieve. He wants to, you know, lower inflation, lower the price of gas, lower the price of food. Those are things that we can help him with. Right. So how does that then feed into the problem if he is now having to deal with, you know, a more expensive cost of everything, well, then maybe that's an opportunity to reason with the folks around him. But yeah, the finding the ways to make this better in a circumstance of we want to use that muscle to just have more economic strength. It's going to be hard.
I feel like we're really hamstrung here because we're arguing facts and trying to apply rational political analysis to it, right? And
Right.
he promised to make everything cheaper, price of gas. So even a 10% tariff on oil and gas versus 25, that's like a 30 cent a liter, 20 to 25 cent a liter hit. But then he says, Fred, tariffs don't cause inflation. They cause great success. And he cited this period beginning in around 1870 as they came out of the Civil War and had tough tariffs and protectionist policies as we've never been richer. And what do you do there, right?
Well, I will admit I haven't studied that period closely and the political ramifications.
A lot of smallpox and things like that,
So look, sadly, this is going to happen. We're going to see it. I think we're probably on the correct side of this, that this is going to lead to massive inflation, and he's going to be proven wrong, and it's going to have potentially long-term consequences for both countries.
It's interesting, I'm not an economist, but I've been reading a lot of economic theory on tariffs, and in terms of inflation, you get that initial hit when the tariff is applied, but it's not necessarily a persistent month-over-month increase. It's just, it really sucks because prices are up and they're staying at that level. So the rate of inflation, you may not go back to things, but you're going to see a price shock, Greg. And then the challenge is as the Prime Minister and his ministers and his advisors are calibrating the response and what you can hit and how you can hit it, anything you do back can compound the misery on this side of it if there's no easy options. And going, to the political situation you're in with the calendar where it is, man, that's tough for them.
Yeah, and the other thing is, if you've been watching the new press secretary at the White House, there are some media organizations in that room that didn't used to be in the room, and you're going to be surprised that they're not known for their journalistic integrity. And so if the economy in the United States is impacted negatively like we expect it to be, we can't even count on that the stories are going to be told the same way, accurately, so that he could make up whatever he wants as the reasons, and he's probably going to have, he's said some pretty provocative things about what he could get away with. We're probably going to see some real wallet-hitting impacts, and his supporters may still think it's Joe Biden's fault, or it's funny, the awful plane crash this week. I was with a client and I mentioned that there was a similar one in the early 80s, and Ronald Reagan, there was a man who rescued someone, and the State of the Union was a couple of weeks later. Ronald Reagan recognized that person, and my client said, did Ronald Reagan blame Jimmy Carter? And that's kind of,
sure did.
Yeah, so this is I think this is going to be a big challenge, is that we're not even going to potentially get the truth.
Well, you've touched on something there because, Mel, this is something all the journalists, we all talking about what's happening in the White House briefing room. The first question traditionally when the press secretary for the president comes out, goes to the Associated Press, right? The oldest reliable news service in the world. It's not happening anymore, right? The first question today was to a podcast hosts a podcast called Ruthless. Now, it's not about cruelty, ruthlessness. It is about life after the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, so ruthless. And that was the person who got the first question, right? And so the information silos it will be a thing, right, in terms of making the argument to the American public.
And when you need fact-checking and rigorous journalism now more than ever, to your point, that is kind of interesting to see how that goes, and the ability for folks to do something about it also almost seems a little bit on shaky ground when you're not getting the facts, you're not getting the information. So yeah, that's not a new change. Obviously, it's maybe a new change in the White House, but something that we've started seeing a little bit of a shift towards. I don't think that it's a helpful shift. I don't know that you can point to good coming out of that, because it's really hard to fact check. It is really hard you can get on a podcast and say whatever you want. You don't have the same standards or guidelines that journalists obviously follow. So that's, it's tough.
Yeah, it was interesting. It was just earlier this week, I believe, we had the report on the foreign interference inquiry that said that it's misinformation and disinformation that's the biggest threats to democracy. Okay, I'm just going to give you an idea of where we are, if you're watching at home, and just get a little bit of clarity from the control room. We are expecting a press conference soon from about 10 minutes away from 3 ministers in Washington, D.C. Melanie Joly, the Foreign Affairs Minister, is there. David McGuinty, the Public Safety Minister, is there. And I believe it's Mark Miller, the Immigration Minister. Okay, maybe. That's what we're being told. And will we be saying goodbye to Fred and Greg and Mel in just a second? Okay, all right. Actually, all right, we're going to quickly, though, before I say goodbye to them, what do you think these ministers need to say? What can they say? Greg, just Fred, a quick 10 seconds.
We've decided we need to call an election now to beg the Prime Minister to do so.
Okay, more seriously, what do you think they can say about the situation right now?
Look, something that's real and tangible, and I think it started already during pandemic. Buy local, buy Canadian. Start looking at what you can do to support businesses in your community. That's something everyone can do right now.
Mel?
I think you just need to reassure people that we're handling it. We're doing something. We're trying to figure out how to help folks. I think if you're not going to be able to say how those conversations are going, but you can at least tell people that you're working on it.
Yeah, yeah. Especially when we still really, truly don't know.
Totally.
He says so many things, and who knows where they're gonna land. Fred Delory, Greg McKecker, and Melanie Richer. Always look forward to Friday. Thank you so much.